Marcus Thompson had always considered himself a rational man. At 32, he worked as a software engineer for a tech startup in Portland, Oregon, spending most of his days debugging code and attending endless meetings about user interface improvements. His life was predictable, comfortable, and utterly ordinary. He lived alone in a modest apartment, had a small circle of friends, and his biggest adventure was usually trying a new restaurant on the weekends. That's why when his college buddy Jake Martinez invited him on a backpacking trip through the Cascade Mountains, Marcus almost declined. "Come on, man," Jake had insisted over beers at their usual dive bar. "When's the last time you did something that didn't involve a computer screen? You're turning into a hermit." Jake wasn't wrong. Marcus had been feeling increasingly disconnected from the world outside his cubicle. The pandemic had made him even more reclusive, and even though things had returned to normal, he found himself struggling to break out of his isolation bubble. So, against his better judgment, he agreed to the 5-day hiking expedition. The first 3 days had been surprisingly enjoyable. The mountain air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the city smog he'd grown accustomed to. Jake proved to be an excellent hiking companion, knowledgeable about the trails and patient with Marcus's obvious inexperience. They'd covered about 15 miles each day, setting up camp at designated sites and sharing stories around small campfires. Marcus began to remember why he'd enjoyed outdoor activities in college, before career pressures and urban living had consumed his life. It was on the fourth day that everything went catastrophically wrong. They decided to take a more challenging route, one that Jake insisted would offer spectacular views of Mount Hood. The trail was less marked than the previous paths they'd taken, winding through dense forest with steep inclines and rocky terrain. Marcus was struggling to keep up, his legs burning from the exertion, when they reached a particularly treacherous section. The path narrowed significantly, with a steep drop-off on one side and a rocky wall on the other. Jake went first, moving with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. Marcus followed more cautiously, testing each step before committing his full weight. That's when he heard Jake shout from up ahead. "Marcus, there's been a rock slide up here. The path is completely blocked." Marcus tried to turn around on the narrow ledge to head back the way they'd come, but as he pivoted, his hiking boot caught on a loose stone. The rock gave way beneath his foot, and suddenly he was falling, tumbling down the steep slope through brush and over jagged rocks. He heard Jake screaming his name from above, but the sound grew fainter as he crashed through branches and bounced off boulders. The fall seemed to last forever, though it probably only took seconds. Marcus felt his backpack tear away, his water bottles and supplies scattering. His shoulder slammed into a tree trunk with a sickening crack, and pain exploded through his body. Finally, mercifully, He came to rest in a small clearing, his body tangled in thick undergrowth. When he regained consciousness, the forest was eerily quiet. Above, he could hear Jake calling for him, but the voice sounded impossibly distant. Marcus tried to respond, but only a weak croak emerged from his throat. He attempted to sit up and immediately regretted it as waves of agony washed over him. His left shoulder was definitely dislocated or broken, maybe both. His head pounded, and he could taste blood in his mouth. Worse, when he tried to move his right leg, nothing happened. He couldn't feel anything below his knee. Panic began to set in as the reality of his situation became clear. He was badly injured, possibly paralyzed, and stranded in a remote section of forest where rescue would be extremely difficult. His cell phone had been in his backpack, which was nowhere to be seen. Jake would try to get help, but how would anyone find him down here? The canopy was so thick that he doubted he'd be visible from above, even to helicopters. As the hours passed, Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness. The pain was constant and overwhelming, making it difficult to think clearly. He tried to stay awake, knowing that falling asleep with a head injury could be dangerous, but exhaustion kept pulling him under. The forest around him was alive with sounds, birds calling, insects buzzing, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, but he felt utterly alone. Night fell with surprising suddenness. The temperature dropped significantly, and Marcus realized he was in serious trouble. Without proper shelter or warm clothing, hypothermia was a real possibility. He'd lost his jacket in the fall, and his t-shirt and hiking pants offered little protection against the mountain cold. He tried to gather fallen leaves and branches to create some insulation, but his injuries made movement excruciating. It was during his second night in the forest that he first heard the footsteps. At first, he thought he might be hallucinating from the head injury or dehydration. The steps were soft but deliberate, circling his position at a distance. Whatever was out there was being careful, cautious. Marcus's heart raced as he considered the possibilities: bears, mountain lions, or other predators that might view him as easy prey in his weakened state. "Hello," he called out weakly, though he wasn't sure if he wanted an answer. The footsteps stopped immediately, and the forest fell silent except for his own labored breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds resumed, closer this time. Marcus strained his eyes in the darkness but could see nothing beyond the dim shapes of trees and brush. Then, just as suddenly as they'd begun, the footsteps stopped altogether. Marcus waited, every muscle tense despite his injuries, but heard nothing more. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and he slipped into an uneasy sleep filled with strange dreams of being watched by unseen eyes. When dawn broke on his third day in the forest, Marcus knew he was dying. The pain had evolved into a constant, numbing ache that made it hard to focus on anything else. He hadn't had water in over a day, and his lips were cracked and bleeding. His injured leg had swollen grotesquely, and he suspected infection was setting in. Most frightening of all, he'd begun to experience moments of confusion and disorientation that suggested his head injury was more serious than he'd initially thought. He spent the morning trying to fashion some kind of signal that might attract attention, arranging rocks in an SOS pattern, though he doubted anyone would see it through the forest canopy. The effort exhausted him completely, and he collapsed back into the small depression where he'd been sheltering, gasping for breath and fighting waves of nausea. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought she might be another hallucination. A figure emerged from the tree line about 50 yards away, moving with fluid grace through the underbrush. As she came closer, Marcus could see that she was a woman, probably in her 30s, with long dark hair and skin that seemed to glow with health and vitality. She wore simple clothing, a earth-toned tunic and pants that looked handmade, and moved through the forest with the confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness. What struck Marcus most was her expression. There was no surprise or alarm at finding an injured stranger in the middle of nowhere. Instead, her face showed a mixture of concern and something else, recognition perhaps, as if she'd been looking for him specifically. She approached slowly, her hands visible and empty, the way someone might approach a frightened animal. When she was close enough to speak in a normal voice, she knelt down beside him and said something that made Marcus question his sanity. "I've been waiting for you, Marcus Thompson." The fact that she knew his name should have terrified him, but somehow it didn't. There was something profoundly calming about her presence, a sense of safety he hadn't felt since the accident. Her voice was soft but carried an unusual accent he couldn't place, not quite American, but not obviously foreign either. "How do you know my name?" he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. She smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise. "There's much I need to tell you, but first, let me help with your injuries. You're in considerable pain." Marcus wanted to ask more questions, but the woman was already examining his wounds with professional competence. Her touch was gentle but sure as she assessed his shoulder, checked his pupils for signs of concussion, and carefully probed his injured leg. Throughout the examination, she maintained a steady stream of quiet commentary, though some of her observations struck him as odd. "The bone alignment isn't as bad as it appears," she murmured, manipulating his shoulder with surprising strength. "Your body is already beginning the healing process, though not as quickly as it should." She seemed to have an extensive knowledge of medicine, but her methods were unlike anything Marcus had encountered. Instead of splints or bandages, she gathered specific plants from the surrounding forest, crushing leaves between her fingers and creating poultices that she applied to his injuries. The relief was almost immediate. The constant pain that had been his companion for 3 days began to subside to manageable levels. "Who are you?" Marcus asked as she worked. "Are you a doctor? How did you find me?" "My name is Elena," she replied, not looking up from her work. "As for how I found you, that's part of what we need to discuss. But not here, and not while you're in such a weakened state." She helped him sit up, supporting his weight with surprising ease for someone of her size. From a leather pouch at her side, she produced a wooden cup and what appeared to be a water bottle made from some kind of gourd. The water was cool and pure, unlike anything Marcus had ever tasted. As he drank, he felt strength returning to his body in a way that seemed almost miraculous. "Where did you come from?" he asked between sips. "There aren't supposed to be any settlements in this area." Elena's expression grew serious. "There's much about this forest that isn't widely known. My people have lived here for generations, though we prefer to remain unnoticed by the outside world." "Your people." "It's complicated." She stood and shouldered a pack Marcus hadn't noticed before. "Can you walk if I help you? My home isn't far, and you'll be much safer there while you recover." Marcus tested his leg gingerly and was amazed to find that, while it was still painful, it seemed to be supporting his weight again. The swelling had gone down dramatically, and the numbness had been replaced by a tingling sensation that suggested returning circulation. "I don't understand what's happening," he said as Elena helped him to his feet. "3 hours ago, I thought I was going to die out here, and now you're beginning to heal." Elena's smile was enigmatic. "That's not entirely coincidental, Marcus. There are things about yourself that you don't yet understand." As they began walking through the forest, Elena supporting much of his weight, Marcus found his mind racing with questions. How had this woman found him in the middle of nowhere? How did she know his name? And what did she mean about things he didn't understand about himself? The forest seemed different as they walked, more alive somehow. Marcus noticed details he'd missed during his hiking trip with Jake. The way the light filtered through the canopy in complex patterns, the subtle variations in the sounds of different bird species, the rich sense of earth and growing things that filled the air. It was as if his accident had somehow heightened his senses. Elena led him along paths that weren't visible until they were walking on them, routes that seemed to follow the natural contours of the landscape so perfectly they might have been carved by water or wind rather than human feet. Despite his injuries, Marcus found the walking easier than it should have been, as if the forest itself was helping support his steps. "Elena," he said during one of their brief rest stops, "what did you mean when you said you'd been waiting for me? How could you possibly have known I would be here?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring off into the trees with an expression Marcus couldn't read. When she finally spoke, her words sent a chill down his spine despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. "Because, Marcus Thompson, you're not entirely human. and it's time you learned the truth about what you really are. As they continued deeper into the forest, Marcus struggled to process what Alina had just told him. Not entirely human. It sounded like something out of a fantasy novel, completely absurd. Yet something deep inside him, some instinct he'd never acknowledged, whispered that her words might be true. He thought about the strange dreams he'd been having lately, the way he'd always felt slightly out of place in the human world, the inexplicable connection he felt to wild places. The path they followed wound deeper into the forest than Marcus would have thought possible. According to his mental map of the area, they should have reached a road or ranger station by now, but instead the wilderness seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. The trees grew larger and older, their trunks so massive that it would take several people holding hands to encircle them. Some of the plant species were unlike anything he'd seen before, with leaves that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light, and flowers that hummed with the activity of insects he couldn't identify. "How much farther?" Marcus asked, though truthfully he found himself less tired than he'd expected. The healing Alina had performed seemed to have given him energy as well as pain relief. "We're almost there," she replied, "just over this next ridge." As they crested the hill, Marcus stopped in his tracks, speechless at what lay before them. Nestled in a valley that seemed impossible to reach from any direction, was a settlement unlike anything he'd ever seen. The buildings were constructed from living trees, their walls formed by carefully guided growth rather than cut lumber. Bridges of woven branches connected structures at different levels, creating a three-dimensional community that existed in harmony with the forest canopy. People moved through the settlement with the same fluid grace Alina displayed, and as Marcus watched, he realized they weren't entirely human either. Some had features that were subtly pointed, others moved with an animal-like fluidity, and a few seemed to shimmer slightly in the dappled sunlight. Children played games that involved impossible leaps between tree branches, while adults tended gardens that grew both familiar vegetables and plants that seemed to glow with inner fire. "Welcome," Alina said softly, "to your true home." Marcus stared at the impossible settlement before him, his rational mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The software engineer in him wanted to dismiss it all as a hallucination brought on by his head injury, but the evidence was too overwhelming, too detailed to be a product of his imagination. The sense alone, a complex mixture of growing things, cooking food, and something else he couldn't identify, were far too rich and layered to be false. "This isn't possible," he whispered, more to himself than to Alina. "Places like this don't exist. People like this don't exist." Alina squeezed his hand gently. "The human world has taught you to reject anything that doesn't fit into neat categories. But Marcus, you've always known, haven't you? Deep down, you've always felt different, out of place in that world of concrete and technology." She was right, and that terrified him. He had always felt like an outsider, even among his closest friends and family. There had always been a restlessness in him, a longing for something he couldn't name. In quiet moments, especially when he was in natural settings, he'd felt a strange stirring in his chest, as if some part of him was trying to wake up. "What am I?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "You're what we call a bridge walker," Elena explained as they began descending toward the settlement. "Born of two worlds but belonging fully to neither. Your mother was human, but your father was one of us." "That's impossible. I knew my father. He was an accountant from Ohio. He died when I was 12. Elena shook her head. "The man who raised you was a good man, and he loved you as his own son. But he wasn't your biological father. Your mother never told you the truth because she was trying to protect you, to give you a normal human life." As they walked, Elena began to tell him a story that sounded like mythology but felt true in his bones. She spoke of an ancient people who had lived alongside humanity for millennia, hiding in the wild places of the world. They were shapeshifters, elemental beings, guardians of the natural world who had learned to remain invisible to protect both themselves and the balance of nature. "We call ourselves the Etherian," Elena explained. "We're not immortal, but we live much longer than humans, and we have abilities that your kind would consider magical. We can communicate with animals, influence plant growth, heal injuries that would be fatal to humans, and yes, change our shape when necessary." "And you're saying I'm part Etherian?" "Half," she confirmed, "which makes you incredibly rare and valuable to both worlds. Bridge walkers are born perhaps once in a generation, and many never discover their true nature. They live their entire lives feeling incomplete, never understanding why they can't quite fit into human society." Marcus thought about his childhood, the way he'd always been drawn to wild places, how he'd seemed to have an unusual connection with animals. His mother had always joked that he could calm any dog or cat just by being near them. He'd never thought much of it, but now. "My mother," he said suddenly, "does she know about you, about what I am?" Elena's expression grew sad. "She knew. She fell in love with your father when she was hiking alone in these very mountains 23 years ago. He saved her from a bear attack, and they spent 3 days together before she had to return to her world. When she discovered she was pregnant, she tried to find him again, but our people can be difficult to locate when we don't wish to be found." "Why didn't she tell me?" "Because she wanted you to have a choice. If you never awaken to your Etherian heritage, you could live a full human life. But if you did awaken, she hoped you would find your way here eventually." They had reached the outskirts of the settlement now, and Marcus could see that the residents were watching their approach with curious but welcoming expressions. Children peeked out from behind their parents, their eyes wide with interest. Some of the adults nodded respectfully to Elena, while others stepped forward as if to offer assistance. "Elena has brought the bridge walker," one elderly woman said, her voice carrying clearly despite its soft tone. "The forest spirits have been restless, waiting for his arrival." "Bridge walker," Marcus looked around at the gathering crowd. "How do they know what I am? How do you all know?" "Because, my dear boy," the elderly woman said with a warm smile, "you smell like both worlds. It's quite distinctive once you know what to look for." Elena led him to what appeared to be a large common area in the center of the settlement, where a group of adults were waiting. They arranged themselves in a loose circle, and Marcus found himself gently guided to sit in the center. The attention made him uncomfortable, but there was nothing threatening about these people. If anything, he felt safer than he had in years. "Marcus Thompson," Elena said formally, "I present you to the Council of Elders of the Westwood Etherian. They've been waiting to meet you for a very long time." An older man with silver hair and remarkably youthful features stepped forward. "Welcome, young bridge walker. I am Aldrich, speaker for this community. We have indeed been waiting, though perhaps not as long as Elena suggests." He shot her an amused look. "Only about 15 years." 15 years. Marcus's head was spinning. "How could you know about me for 15 years?" "Because," Aldrich said gently, "your awakening was foretold. There are signs, portents if you will, that appear when a bridge walker approaches their time of choosing. The animals in the forest began behaving differently. The plants grew more vigorously. Even the weather patterns shifted slightly, all pointing toward this moment. A moment of choosing. Every bridge walker must eventually decide which world they will call home," another elder explained. A woman with intricate braids and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. "You can return to your human life, though you'll never be able to completely forget what you've learned here. Or you can embrace your Etherian heritage and learn to live as one of us." "But I don't understand any of this," Marcus protested. "I'm a software engineer. I live in an apartment and eat takeout and watch Netflix. I don't know anything about whatever it is you people do." Aldrich chuckled. "We know about your human life, Marcus. We've been watching over you discreetly since you were a child. Your unusual affinity for technology isn't despite your Etherian heritage, it's because of it. We are beings of connection, of understanding the patterns that link all things. In your world, you expressed that gift through code and systems. Here, you could learn to apply it to the living world itself." Elena knelt beside him. "No one is asking you to decide immediately. The injuries you sustained in your fall will take time to heal completely, even with our help. Stay with us for a while. Learn about this part of yourself. Then make your choice with full knowledge of both worlds." Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him, kind, patient, but also hopeful. These people clearly wanted him to stay, to become one of them. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was all elaborate nonsense, possibly an elaborate cult that had found him at his most vulnerable moment. But a deeper part of him, a part he'd spent 32 years ignoring, whispered that he was finally, truly home. "Okay," he said quietly, "I'll stay, at least until I understand what's happening to me." The smiles that broke out around the circle were radiant, and Marcus felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. For the first time in his adult life, he felt like he might actually belong somewhere. As the crowd began to disperse, Alina helped him to his feet. "Come," she said, "let me show you where you'll be staying. And Marcus," she paused, her expression serious, "I need you to know that by staying, by opening yourself to this world, you're going to change. Not just mentally or emotionally, but physically. The Etherian blood in you will begin to assert itself. Are you prepared for that?" Marcus thought about his old life, the sterile apartment, the endless meetings, the constant feeling of being slightly out of sync with everyone around him. Then he looked at the impossible, beautiful settlement around him, at people who moved with grace and purpose and seemed to glow with inner contentment. "I think," he said slowly, "I've been preparing for this my entire life without knowing it." Alina smiled and led him toward a tree house that seemed to have grown specifically to accommodate a newcomer, its rooms perfectly sized and positioned to catch the best light and air. As they climbed the spiraling ramp that led to his temporary home, Marcus felt the last of his resistance crumble away. Whatever came next, whatever he was about to become, it had to be better than the half-life he'd been living. For the first time since his fall, he allowed himself to feel hope about the future. The treehouse Alina led him to was unlike anything Marcus had ever imagined. The walls weren't walls in any conventional sense, but rather living wood that had been coaxed and shaped into flowing, organic curves. Windows weren't cut into the structure, but had been encouraged to grow as natural openings, their edges soft and rounded like the hollow of an ancient oak. Furniture had been cultivated rather than built, chairs and tables that sprouted from the floor, shelves that were actually specialized branches, and a bed that was somehow both wooden and as comfortable as any mattress he'd ever used. "How is this possible?" Marcus asked, running his hand along a wall that felt warm and seemed to pulse gently under his touch. "Etherian architecture," Alina explained. "We don't build homes so much as we grow them. Each structure is alive, responsive to the needs of its inhabitant. The tree will adapt to your presence over time, providing exactly what you need for comfort and safety." As if to demonstrate her point, a section of the wall near the window began to reshape itself, forming what looked like a perfect workspace complete with a surface that could serve as a desk and natural lighting that would be ideal for reading or detailed work. "It knows what you do for a living," Alina said with amusement, "though I suspect you'll find your interests evolving during your stay here." She left him to rest and explore his new accommodations, promising to return in the evening with food and to begin his education about Etherian culture. Alone for the first time since the rescue, Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the silence. Not the empty, sterile quiet of his apartment, but a rich, living silence filled with subtle sounds. The whisper of wind through leaves, the distant murmur of voices, the gentle creaking of living wood adjusting to his presence. He moved to the window and looked out over the settlement. Even from this elevated position, he couldn't see all of it. The community seemed to extend both horizontally and vertically through the forest, with bridges and platforms connecting trees at various levels. Gardens were everywhere, not neat rows of planted vegetables, but complex ecosystems that seemed to produce food as a natural byproduct of their existence. Children played in areas that would have terrified him as a parent, leaping between branches 30 feet off the ground, but moving with such confidence and grace that injury seemed impossible. He watched one young boy, perhaps 8 years old, miss his grip on a branch and begin to fall, only to have vines suddenly sprout from nearby trees to catch him gently and lower him to safety. The child laughed and immediately began climbing again. As the day progressed, Marcus noticed subtle changes in himself. The pain from his injuries continued to fade, but more than that, his senses seemed to be sharpening. He could distinguish individual conversations from the general murmur of the settlement below. Sense became more complex and informative. He could smell rain coming long before any clouds appeared, could detect the emotional states of people passing nearby, could even sense the health and contentment of the various plants that grew around his tree house. When Alina returned that evening, she brought with her a meal that looked like nothing from any restaurant or grocery store he'd ever visited, but tasted like the most satisfying food he'd ever eaten. Fruits that glowed softly with bioluminescence, vegetables that seemed to contain more flavors than should be possible, and a grain-based dish that made him feel energized rather than heavy. "Your senses are awakening," Alina observed as she watched him eat. "That's always the first sign that the Etherian blood is asserting itself. How do you feel?" "Different," Marcus admitted. "More awake, I guess. Like I've been seeing the world through a fog my entire life and it's finally clearing." That's exactly what's happening. Human senses are limited by necessity. If they experienced the world the way we do, they'd be overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information. But you have the capacity for both modes of perception. What else will change? Alina considered the question carefully. It varies with each individual, But most bridge walkers develop enhanced physical abilities, strength, speed, agility, healing. Many can communicate with animals or influence plant growth. Some develop shape-shifting abilities, though that usually comes later and requires significant training. Shape-shifting, Marcus nearly choked on his food, like turning into animals or plants, or even temporarily taking on characteristics of natural phenomena like wind or water. But Marcus, these abilities aren't parlor tricks or superpowers. They're tools for maintaining the balance between the natural world and human civilization. Bridge walkers who choose to embrace their heritage often become guardians, protectors of wild places that are threatened by human expansion. That night, alone in his living tree house, Marcus found sleep elusive despite his exhaustion. His mind raced with possibilities and implications. If what Alina was telling him was true, if he really was part of this hidden world of magical beings, what did that mean for his future? Could he ever go back to his old life, knowing what he now knew? Would he even want to? He thought about Jake, who was probably frantic with worry and guilt over the accident. Search and rescue teams were likely still looking for him, and his absence from work would have been noticed by now. His mother would be worried sick when she learned he was missing. But how could he explain any of this to them? How could he return to debugging code and sitting in meetings when there was this entire other world he'd never imagined? Over the following days, Alina introduced him to other members of the community, and Marcus began to understand the complexity of Etherian society. They weren't the primitive, mystical beings he might have expected from fairy tales. Instead, they were highly sophisticated people who had simply chosen a different relationship with technology and nature. There was Thorn, a master of plant cultivation who could make crops grow in soil that should have been barren, and who was working on developing new varieties of food plants that could thrive in the changing climate. Dr. Willow, who had trained as a physician in the human world before awakening to her Etherian heritage, now served as the community's healer, combining traditional medicine with natural abilities to treat ailments that would baffle conventional doctors. Most fascinating to Marcus was David, another bridge walker who had made the transition from human to Etherian life 15 years earlier. David had been an environmental scientist, and he'd found ways to use his human education alongside his developing Etherian abilities to become a guardian of old-growth forests throughout the Pacific Northwest. The hardest part, David told him during one of their long conversations, wasn't learning to use my abilities or adapting to life here. It was saying goodbye to the human world, to family and friends who could never understand what I'd become. Do you regret it? David was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the forest canopy. I regret the pain it caused people I loved. My parents still think I died in a hiking accident, but regret the choice itself. Never. I found my purpose here, Marcus. I found out who I was meant to be. As his second week in the settlement began, Marcus started experiencing what Alina called resonance events, moments when his connection to the natural world became so strong it was almost overwhelming. He would touch a tree and suddenly feel its entire root system, understand its relationship with every other plant in the area, sense the insects and small animals that lived in its bark and branches. During one particularly intense episode, he found himself mentally connected to an entire grove of ancient cedars, experiencing their slow, patient thoughts and their deep memories of centuries of forest history. "It's beautiful," he told Alina afterward, though he was shaking from the intensity of the experience. "But it's also terrifying. I feel like I could lose myself in it, just dissolve into the forest and never come back." "That's why we train for years to master these abilities," she replied. "The connection to the natural world is intoxicating, especially for someone who's been cut off from it for most of their life. But you have to maintain your individual consciousness, your human sense of self, or you'll be of no use to either world." "Is that what happened to some bridge walkers? They got lost?" Alina's expression grew sad. "A few, yes. The pull of the wild is strong, and some people choose to surrender their individual identity to become part of something larger. It's not necessarily a bad fate, but it means they can no longer serve as bridges between worlds." The possibility both thrilled and terrified Marcus. The idea of merging completely with the forest, of becoming part of something ancient and eternal, held a strange appeal. But he also thought about his human life, about his mother, about Jake, who was probably still searching for him, and he knew he wasn't ready to abandon that world entirely. His abilities continued to develop rapidly. By the end of his third week, he could encourage plants to grow with just a touch, could understand the basic communications of birds and small mammals, and had discovered that he could run through the forest at speeds that should have been impossible, leaping between trees and navigating dense undergrowth, as if he'd been doing it his entire life. The physical changes were becoming more apparent as well. His build had always been lean, but now muscle definition appeared that hadn't been there before, and his endurance seemed limitless. His hair, previously a ordinary brown, now had highlights that seemed to shift color depending on the light and his mood. Most dramatically, his eyes had begun to change. The brown was now flecked with gold and green, and Alina told him they sometimes glowed slightly in the dark. "Am I still human?" he asked her one evening as they sat on a platform high in the canopy, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. "You're becoming something new," she replied. "Not fully human, not fully Etherian, but something that incorporates the best of both. That's the gift and burden of being a bridge walker. You'll never entirely belong to either world, but you'll be able to move between them in ways that others cannot. That night, Marcus made his decision. He would complete his transformation and learn to master his abilities, but he would not abandon his human connections entirely. Somehow, he would find a way to serve as an actual bridge between the two worlds, to use his unique position to protect the natural places that were disappearing while still maintaining ties to the human community that had raised him. It was an ambitious goal, perhaps an impossible one, but for the first time in his adult life, Marcus felt like he had found his true calling. The wounded man who had fallen into this hidden valley was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood his place in the larger tapestry of existence. The next morning, he sought out Aldrich to formally request full training as an Etherian bridge walker. The elder's smile told him that this moment had been anticipated and welcomed. Welcome, truly, to your awakening, Marcus Thompson. Now the real work begins. The training that followed was unlike anything Marcus had imagined. It wasn't the mystical meditation and cryptic teachings he might have expected from movies or books about magical beings. Instead, it was rigorous, scientific, and intensely practical. The Etherian had spent millennia developing techniques for safely channeling and controlling their abilities, and they approached teaching with the same methodical precision that Marcus had once applied to software engineering. His days began before dawn with physical conditioning that would have killed his former self. Running through the forest while maintaining mental contact with various animals, leaping between trees while solving complex puzzles that Alina presented telepathically, lifting and moving boulders that should have been impossible for someone his size to budge. But his body adapted quickly, growing stronger and more coordinated with each passing day. The mental training was even more challenging. He learned to compartmentalize his consciousness, maintaining his individual identity while simultaneously connecting with natural systems. Alina taught him to build what she called firewalls in his mind, barriers that would prevent him from being overwhelmed by the thoughts and feelings of the forest, while still allowing him to access the information he needed.